counts as a solution in mystery and suspense fiction? At first glance, the question hardly seems worth asking. The answer is so obvious: the apprehension of the criminal. Well, that's not a bad try as answers go, but it's inadequate for a number of reasons. First, some examples of the genre have resolutions that don't involve the apprehension of a criminal. Second, some involve the apprehension of a criminal, but aren't really resolved through that apprehension. Third, some examples of the genre don't really have resolutions in the conventional sense at all, but instead are left conspicuously open-ended. This list of exceptions to the rule goes on, but I hope my point is clear. The issue of how and even whether mystery and suspense narratives are resolved is much more complicated than it first appears. This is an important point, not only because it emphasizes the variety, flexibility, and adaptability of the genre, but also because it raises a crucial question. Why do we read mystery and suspense fiction in the first place? Raymond Chandler once famously remarked that the ideal mystery was one you would read if the end was missing. It's a brave attempt on Chandler's part to de-emphasize the importance of the solution in examples of the genre, but I have a feeling that most readers would disagree. Because the solution appears to be the payoff to the genre, the reason why we read mysteries at all. As I'll demonstrate in this lecture, however, the issue of both the solution and how that issue connects to why we read mysteries is much more complicated than it first appears. Let's begin by looking at the genre-founding work of Edgar Allan Poe and see what his mystery tales tell us about how the earliest examples of the genre handle the question of the solution. Poe's first mystery tale, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, seemingly has a very unambiguous solution. Those responsible for the murders of Madame and Mademoiselle L'Espanaye are identified. And yet, let's pause for a moment and consider the implications of the fact that they are identified but not arrested or punished. Bearing in mind the fact that the perpetrator is an orangutan, we can understand why neither Poe nor his detective, Dupin, insists on the ape's punishment. But surely the Maltese sailor who was careless enough to let the beast escape deserves some kind of punishment. What Rue Morgue demonstrates is the fact that in many early examples of mystery and suspense fiction, the solution is whatever the detective says it is. In other words, if the detective is satisfied, then we are meant to be satisfied too. Our reliance on the detective's definition of a solution is even clearer in what is easily the most open-ended of Poe's three mystery tales, The Mystery of Marie Roget. The conclusion of Dupin's investigation into the murder of Roget concludes with Dupin outlining a possible course of future investigation that will, in his judgment, lead to the apprehension of the killer. Even though a parenthetical paragraph in the story reassures us that following up on Dupin's advice meant that the result desired was brought to pass, the average reader can be forgiven for wanting a more concrete and unmistakable sense of resolution by story's end. Even in the Purloined Letter, Poe's third and final mystery tale, in which the identity of the criminal is known from the beginning of the story, we have to make do with the anticipation of closure rather than actual closure. Dupin not only successfully recovers the stolen letter from the Minister D, but he also replaces it with a facsimile letter that will, in time, result in the minister's destruction. And yet, we are forced to imagine that outcome because Poe chooses not to show it to us, no matter how satisfying it would have been to see the minister get his just deserts. In just 3 stories, then, we can already see how the earliest examples of the genre contain a variety of different solutions. And more to the point, we also see solutions that many readers might be dissatisfied with because they seem incomplete or lacking in some way. So why is Dupin satisfied by these outcomes? Because in each of these 3 cases, what is at stake for Dupin is proving his ability to analyze the situation and disentangle the mystery. To put it another way, Dupin focuses on the means rather than the ends. The demonstration of a method rather than the solution is the payoff for the detective, and it is expected to be the payoff for the reader too. With this background in mind, it's clear that one of the ways in which Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie innovate upon the work of their predecessor, and one of the reasons their work is so popular, is by developing solutions that are far more audience-friendly. And yet, it's worth noting that in A Scandal in Bohemia, the first Holmes short story, Doyle chooses a very unexpected ending. Charged by the King of Bohemia with retrieving a compromising photograph of the king and a woman named Irene Adler, Holmes fails to recover the photograph, and to make matters worse, Adler escapes to Europe. Why would Doyle show his apparently infallible detective failing? Partly because he wanted to show that Holmes, in contrast to Poe's rather repellent and two-dimensional Auguste Dupin, is more human, more flawed, and therefore easier for the average reader to relate to. We're also meant to note, I think, that Holmes doesn't really fail in this case. His client, the king, is satisfied with the outcome, and Holmes still gets paid for his trouble. Nevertheless, this was not an experiment that Doyle would repeat. After all, who wants to read a series of stories about a detective in which the solution is always that the detective fails to solve the case? Doyle very wisely stuck to more conventional solutions in the vast majority of his other mysteries, and I would divide those solutions broadly into 2 types. The first appears in The Red-Headed League, and it is characterized by the apprehension of the criminal. In this case, Holmes and his associates catch bank robber John Clay in the act, and he is arrested and led away by the police. The second type of solution appears in The Adventure of the Speckled Band and results in the death of the criminal. In this instance, Dr. Grimsby Roylott was planning to use a poisonous snake to murder his stepdaughter so that he can inherit her money. Not only does Holmes foil Roylott's plan, but he does so in such a way that the snake ends up killing Roylott instead. It's a matter for speculation which of these 2 types of solution the reader might prefer, but we should note that, like Poe's endings, they're technically somewhat incomplete, in the sense that the stories end when the detective's involvement ends. Even in The Red-Headed League, in which the criminal survives, we never find out what happens to John Clay after his arrest. It's not until the 1930s and the arrival of the courtroom drama, a genre we'll discuss in another lecture, that mystery and suspense fiction takes any interest in the criminal's passage through the legal process and thinks of that passage as a kind of solution in its own right. Until we reach that point, we are meant to be satisfied by knowing that the criminal is in the hands of the law. And yet, Even in the most unambiguous solutions in the Holmes canon, there's often still an air of, if not incompleteness, then at least impermanence. Where does this sense of the temporary come from? We see it at the end of The Red-Headed League when Dr. Watson compliments Holmes on a job well done, and Holmes turns the compliment aside by saying, "It saved me from ennui. Alas, I already feel it closing in upon me. My life is spent in one long effort to escape from the commonplaces of existence. These little problems help me to do so." Holmes's remark implies that the solution in any given case is temporary and that ennui is the only permanent feature of his life. This impression is also conveyed by the sign of 4, which begins with Holmes taking cocaine in an effort to alleviate his boredom and complaining to Watson about having nothing with which to occupy his time and brain. "My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work, and I am in my own proper atmosphere. I can dispense then with artificial stimulants, but I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave for mental exaltation." Holmes soon gets what he wishes for when the exciting adventure of the Sign of 4 begins just a few pages after he complains to Watson. This story involves a fabulous stolen treasure from India and an elaborate conspiracy. However, by the end of the novel, even though Holmes has solved the mystery, the excitement is already starting to ebb away, and the final words of the novel confirm that he's back where he started. "For me," said Sherlock Holmes, "there still remains the cocaine bottle," and he stretched his long white hand up for it. What we see emerging in these Holmes stories is a kind of circularity that undoes any sense of a permanent solution, and we shall see more examples of this pattern soon. But it seems unlikely that we'll see anything of the kind in our next example, the work of Agatha Christie. Perhaps more than anyone else writing in the genre, Christie distinguished herself by her devotion to the idea of turning the solution to a mystery into a highly ritualized and dramatic performance as a way to both underline the importance of the solution and emphasize the degree of definitive closure that the solution brings about. The ABC Murders contains a classic example of a Christie ending in which Hercule Poirot gathers all the suspects together and reveals the name of the murderer. The chapter in which he does this is titled Poirot Explains, and this describes perfectly the function of this expository chapter. Having generated a great deal of narrative confusion and red herring clues over the course of the preceding narrative, Christie now has her detective explain in detail how he arrived at his solution. The murderer is revealed, arrested, and that's seemingly the end of the story. And yet, it often turns out that the criminal's arrest is often not quite the end of a Christie novel in the way that it can be in many Holmes stories. For example, the chapter in which the murderer's identity is revealed in a Christie novel is very often the novel's penultimate chapter. The final chapter that follows usually serves a combination of 3 functions. First, if there are any loose ends left over after the penultimate chapter's revelations, the final chapter clears them up, typically in the form of a conversation between the detective and the sidekick, as with Poirot and Captain Hastings in the ABC Murders. Second, this final chapter may also include the resolution of a romantic subplot in the novel. Often these romances haven't been able to come to fruition because at least one of the parties has been living under a cloud of suspicion. The resolution of the mystery, in other words, also allows for the consummation of the romance. In The Mysterious Affair at Styles, for example, there are two romances that are resolved in the final chapter. One is between the unmarried Lawrence and Cynthia, but the other is between the formerly estranged husband and wife, John and Mary Cavendish, who, thanks to Poirot, now realize they still love each other and are happily reunited at novel's end. In this respect, Captain Hastings characteristically misses the point when he looks at Poirot and comments, "The colossal cheek of the little man. Who on earth but Poirot would have thought of a trial for murder as a restorer of conjugal happiness?" It might seem audacious to the unimaginative Hastings, but in fact, this is exactly what Christie aims to achieve in her solutions to crimes. These solutions enable the restoration and/or creation of order on multiple levels, which is why so many readers have found them so satisfying for so long. And the third and final purpose of the closing chapter of a Christie novel is to burnish, once again, the reputation of her extraordinary detectives. At the end of the ABC murders, for example, Poirot is complimented by Mr. Cust, who had been arrested for the murders, but whom Poirot has proved to be innocent. "You're a very great man, Mr. Poirot." Hastings then comments, somewhat acidly, "Poirot, as usual, did not disdain the compliment. He did not even succeed in looking modest." And why should he? The detective's victory and the confirmation it provides of his or her continued infallibility is perhaps the most important element of a typical Christie solution. When we looked at the work of Conan Doyle, we saw the ways in which he emphasized that the solutions in Holmes' stories were only temporary episodes in Holmes's life, whereas ennui and frustration were permanent. Do we get an equivalent sense of the temporary nature of solutions in Christie's work? I would say yes, but not in the same way and much more implicitly. Consider, for example, the following questions. Why does Miss Marple enjoy such a long career despite her advanced age? Why does Hercule Poirot never retire despite his repeated attempts to do so? There are a number of possible answers to these questions. The most banal is that what we're seeing here is simply a feature of serial fiction. If you have successful series characters, you keep bringing them back. A slightly more complex answer would point to the fact that neither of Christie's detectives are inclined to fade away. Marple likes being useful, and Poirot's vanity means he would never willingly leave the stage. But on a more abstract level, I would argue that there's something else at work here. Marple and Poirot never go away because they cannot. Why can't they leave? Because they are always needed. Why are they always needed? Because no matter how many murders they solve, there's always another killer waiting in the wings. There's always another murder on the way. This is the sense in which even Christie's solutions are temporary. Order can only ever be restored momentarily before violence disrupts it again and again and again in an endless cycle of bloodshed. In this sense, there's a kind of bizarre poetic justice to the fact that in Curtain, the last novel in which Poirot appears, he himself is the murderer. It seems that only when Poirot assumes the role of the killer rather than the detective can the cycle stop. As you can probably tell, I have gone out of my way to make Christie's novels sound as hard-boiled as possible, as unlikely as that may seem. I've done so partly to facilitate the transition into the next part of my lecture, which will look at the work of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, and partly to emphasize the fact that although classical detective fiction has a reputation for having tidy and definitive solutions, the truth is much more complex and ambiguous. Similarly, although hard-boiled mystery and suspense fiction is known for having much more open-ended solutions, it would be more accurate to say that they find a way to combine closure with open-endedness. In Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, for example, technically speaking, Private Eye Philip Marlowe solves the cases that he's asked to solve. He finds out who's blackmailing General Sternwood and makes sure that it won't happen again. And he also finds out what happened to Rusty Reagan, Vivian Sternwood's husband. So why is Marlowe so dissatisfied at the end of the novel? And why does the conclusion feel so open-ended? Mostly because even though the cases are solved, that does not mean that justice has been done. Carmen Sternwood is guilty of the murder of Rusty Reagan, but she'll never be arrested. And Vivian Sternwood is guilty of helping Carmen cover up the murder, but she will never be arrested. Not only does Marlowe's participation in this situation mean that he's given in to the pervasive corruption that defines the world around him, but he's also unable to enjoy the prospect of a romantic resolution à la Christie, as we learn from the final words of the novel. On the way downtown, I stopped at a bar and had a couple of double scotches. They didn't do me any good. All they did was make me think of Silverwig, and I never saw her again. Silverwig refers to Mona Mars, the wife of Eddie Mars, a local crime boss. Mona helps Marlowe escape from a dangerous situation, and although he's clearly enamored of her, Chandler denies his private eye a happy ending. Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon follows a similar pattern. Despite being lied to and manipulated repeatedly throughout the novel, Sam Spade not only recovers the Maltese Falcon, but also succeeds in surviving the temptations personified by the femme fatale Bridget O'Shaughnessy, and he avoids being arrested by the police, both of which are significant accomplishments in their own right. But we are in no way meant to feel that Spade's success is unambiguous, or that this is anything resembling a happy ending. Because Spade turned Bridget over to the police, Effie Perrine, who is not only Spade's secretary, but also the closest thing he has to a confidant in the book, now scorns him and can't even bear to be touched by him. As if this weren't bad enough, the closing scene of the book makes it clear that the past refuses to let go of Spade and that the future is anything but rosy. Spade now has to deal with Ivor, the wife of his murdered partner Miles Archer, and the woman with whom Spade has been having an affair. The book closes with these lines: Ivor is here. Spade, looking down at his desk, nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes, he said, and shivered. Well, send her in. If the reader of classical mystery fiction takes pleasure from at least the convincing appearance of an elegant and tidy solution, hard-boiled writers like Chandler and Hammett are much more explicit about the messiness of solutions in real life. Elements of completion are tangled together with what is left unresolved, and in this case, the reader takes pleasure in precisely this messiness and the absence of a simple solution. Still, It's difficult to generalize about a genre as diverse as mystery and suspense fiction, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that our only choice is a neat binary with tidy classical solutions on one side and messy, hard-boiled solutions on the other. In the final part of this lecture, therefore, I want to discuss a variety of other possible solutions offered by the genre, all of which have their champions, and all of which appeal to different types of readers seeking different types of pleasure. This variety, after all, is precisely the accomplishment of a genre as finely tuned to satisfying niche audiences as mystery and suspense fiction. Although up until this point, we've been working with the assumption that most readers of mystery and suspense fiction prefer unambiguous and tidy solutions, Mickey Spillane proves that this assumption needs to be questioned. In what is probably the ne plus ultra of unambiguous endings, in the final pages of I, the Jury, which tells the story of Private Eye Mike Hammer's search for the killer of his best friend and army buddy Jack Williams, Hammer keeps his promise to his friend to find and kill his murderer in exactly the same manner in which Williams was killed, a bullet to the gut. The killer turns out to be Hammer's girlfriend, Charlotte Manning, but that does not stop Hammer executing brutal vigilante justice, including a detail that made the novel's conclusion notorious. After Hammer shoots Manning, these are the final words of the novel. Her eyes had pain in them now, the pain preceding death, pain and unbelief. How could you, she gasped. I only had a moment before talking to a corpse, but I got it in. It was easy, I said. If you were inclined to defend Spillane, you could say that it's as if he takes the genre's readers at their word when we say we want a tidy solution. He gives us one in spades, and it's so brutal and horrific in its finality that we naturally recoil from it. The moral of the story is to be careful what you wish for. The solutions to many of Jim Thompson's novels are even more violent, uncompromising, and bleak. But Thompson presents the violence in such a way that it's less likely to outrage and more likely to unsettle. With his characteristic combination of pulp sensationalism and modernist literary technique, Thompson finds some brilliantly creative ways to wrap up his frequently hallucinatory tales. The Killer Inside Me, for example, ends with Lou Ford blowing up his house and taking most of his enemies and assorted townspeople with him when he does it. Determined to let him have the last word, however, Thompson allows Lou a posthumous postscript in which he hopes that the next life will be better for himself and for others like him. At the end of A Hell of a Woman, the narrative voice of Thompson's protagonist, Dolly Dillon, actually splits in two as Dillon experiences a schizophrenic break from reality. Accordingly, the last 2 pages of the novel are told from Dillon's double perspective, with one personality taking one line on the page, the other the next line, and then alternating until the end of the novel. If you read carefully, you'll see that one version of Dillon disembowels himself and then throws himself out of a window, while the other version is castrated with a pair of shears by his girlfriend. Thompson's fondness for post-mortem narrators reaches its height, or maybe its depth, depending on your point of view, in Savage Night. The closing scene of this novel depicts Charles Bigger, Thompson's narrator, being dismembered by a woman with an axe, while Bigger describes to us what's happening to him. He finally succumbs to his injuries in the basement of the house, where he has one final meeting, as described in the novel's closing words. And he was there, of course, death was there, and he smelled good. The reference to death is completely appropriate because all of Thompson's solutions involve an encounter with death. In this respect, Thompson could be said to share, albeit in a very different rhetorical register, some of Spillane's uncomfortable honesty about the event that mystery and suspense fiction circle around, namely death, which Thompson presents as the ultimate solution. Writers such as David Goodis and Cornell Woolrich find an intriguing variation on this theme when they find ways to imply that death might be preferable to the solution that faces some of their characters, the seemingly endless and repetitious circularity of life. In Woolrich's I Married a Dead Man and Goodis's Shoot the Piano Player and Street of No Return, the main characters all end the novels in exactly the same way that they began them, either despairing of the future, playing the piano, or sitting in a doorway figuring out how to get a drink. In each case, between the beginning and end of these novels, these characters make what turns out to be a crucial mistake. They get involved with other people. They try to make a difference, and they allow themselves to hope that things can get better. By the end of the novels, they know better, and they return to their former positions, having learned nothing, but having collected a lot of pain, paranoia, and suffering along the way. In these bleakest of noir novels, the very idea of a solution of any kind seems like a sick joke. Finally, I'd like to take a brief look at an experimental mystery novel called The Pledge, published by Swiss writer Friedrich Dürrenmatt in 1958, because it suggests one final variation on the amazing variety of ways in which the genre treats the subject of solutions. Like many experimental writers who are attracted to mystery and suspense fiction, Dürrenmatt reworks the notion of the solution because that's where he finds the most dramatic evidence of the security and certainty he wants to undermine. In fact, I should note that Dürrenmatt's subtitle for The Pledge is Requiem for the Detective Novel. Dürrenmatt's protagonist is a police inspector named Matthias, who pledges to the mother of a murdered child that he'll find the killer. Convinced he has solved the case, Matthias sets a trap for the killer, but he never shows up. Puzzled by his failure, Matthias gradually sinks into alcoholism and insanity while continuing to wait for the killer. Years later, a colleague learns that Matthias had identified the killer correctly and that he didn't show up because he was killed in a car accident on his way to the meeting at which he could have been caught. He tells Matthias that the mystery has been solved, but it's too late to make a difference. Matthias has been on the same path for so long that he's become completely disconnected from reality. What Dürrenmatt shows us is that sometimes the solution to a mystery may be neither too tidy nor too ambiguous. Instead, it may be nothing at all. In Dürrenmatt's hands, we get a solution that seems to match the common sense understanding of how mystery and suspense narratives should end. The criminal is identified. But as we see in The Pledge, sometimes the solution doesn't seem to solve anything. Matthias's sad fate at the end of Dürrenmatt's novel emphasizes both the fact that we love the genre for many reasons other than solutions, and the fact that solutions can take a dizzying variety of forms in mystery and suspense fiction.